Hello and welcome back to Inside the Contract. This is season 2 finale. Okay. This episode isn't just a recap, it's about integration. Across this season, we have explored claims and time bars, notices and procedural compliance, exceptional events and commercial risk, DAABs and dispute resolution, termination rights, and wrongful termination landmines. Now we zoom out and ask the bigger question. How do we design a contract that does not just survive these issues, but uses them to stay stable under pressure? A resilient contract is one that still functions when schedules slip, designs change, markets fluctuate, and stakeholders face real world pressure. That's what we are building toward in this episode. Okay? A resilient contract is more than enforceable. It is clear, parties understand who does what, when, and how, adaptable, can handle change without falling apart, predictable, the consequences of events are known in advance, procedurally robust, notices, claims, and dispute steps are not improvised, they are defined. It should prevent disputes, not just resolve them, convert chaos into structured process, notice, claim, valuation, decision, escalation, etc. Reflect real side conditions, not just a theoretical BOQ on a baseline. In practical terms, a resilient contract is one where scope is unambiguous, risk allocation matches who controls and can mitigate the risk, claims mechanisms are usable in practice, both sides know what happens when things go wrong. It is less about drafting clear traps and more about drafting workable operating system for the project. Okay? FIDIC 2017 gives you a strong generic framework, but it is a starting point, not a turnkey solution. The general conditions give balanced risk allocation at conceptual level, standard mechanisms, notice, claims, DAABs, termination, EOT, etc. A framework that courts, arbitrators, and DAABs recognize globally. But FIDIC does not know your local law quirks, okay? Your project financing models like PPP, EPC, design build, JV, etc. Your interface jungle, multiple contractors, multiple packages, multiple authorities, okay? Your commercial sensitivities. That's where the particular conditions, the PCs, come in. They translate FIDIC into your local legal environment. They adapt the contract to the specific project, employer and locale. They clarify what is vague and tighten what is too generic. A resilient contract invests serious thought in the PCs, aligning with local law and regulatory requirements, reflecting stakeholder dynamics like employer versus JV, PMC, etc., addressing interface complexities and phasing, anticipating political, financial, and supply chain volatility. If the general conditions are the engine, the particular conditions are the tuning and steering system that make the engine usable on the road. Now we revisit key season 2 topics, not in isolation, but as interconnected modules inside a resilient contract. Okay? Resilience in claims starts with clarity and usability. FIDIC 2017 defines notice period, 28 days, detailed claim submission procedures, ongoing updates. But in practice, claims collapse because no one knows what a valid notice looks like. Site teams don't know what must be in the email or letter. PCs are silent or worse, confusing. A resilient contract, therefore, defines valid notice in the PCs, what hidden to use, who it must be addressed to, what minimum content it must contain, event, date, clause, forecast, impact, etc. Adds also templates as an annex. Sample notice for EOT, sample notice for cost claim, sample joint notice, or early warning template. Why? Because tribunals and DAABs penalize vague, late, or informal notices, but are very receptive when the contract gives a clearly defined pattern and the contractor followed it. Okay, so the goal, make claims procedurally strong and simple enough that the site engineers can comply in real time. We saw in episode 8 that exceptional events, the modern force majeure, are often misunderstood. A resilient contract does not leave clause 18 generic. It uses PCs to list specific risks relevant to the project. Examples: pandemic-related shutdowns, regional conflict impacting specific supply routes, government-imposed work stoppages, port closures affecting critical imported materials. It may include, for example, a risk table in an annex. Column A, risk description. Column B, is it an exceptional event? Yes or no. Column C, entitlement. Time only, time plus cost, no entitlement, etc. Where the contract is vague, employers often argue this was priced risk. The outcome then depends on the wording, causation, and evidence. A resilient contract pre-labels major shocks. So when the event hits, you are not arguing about the classification, you are applying the agreed mechanism. We already saw how not having a DAAB or having a purely nominal one leads to claim buildup, frozen disputes, multi-year arbitration as the only outlet. A resilient contract mandates a standing DAAB from the beginning for large, complex projects. It clearly defines in the PCs the following: how members are nominated, how deadlocks are resolved, for example, by FIDIC president or another body, how often the DAAB visits the site or maybe holds virtual sessions. The DAAB decisions are contractually binding immediately, are intended to be complied with unless and until revised through the next step. It may also specify the DAAB can give informal opinions to diffuse disputes early. May also set the strict timelines for referral and decision enforcement. Delays in activating the DAAB means increase in unresolved exposure and almost guaranteed escalation to arbitration later. A resilient contract bakes in a DAAB that is active, accessible, and procedurally integrated with the notices and claims. Termination, as we saw in episode 9, is high voltage. A resilient contract minimizes the chance of a wrongful termination by spelling out every step in the PCs. Pre-warning, default notice, for example, cure period length, engineer's recommendation role, final termination notice format. Including a termination flowchart as an appendix. Maybe that's another option. If contractor breach, step 1 notice, step 2 cure, step 3 engineer review, step 4 termination. Same for contractor termination for non-payment under clause 16. This turns a traumatically complex decision into a checklist. Tribunals love checklists that were followed, and they punish parties that jump straight to termination without them, maybe. A resilient contract makes wrongful termination harder to commit by accident. Okay, most major disputes don't come from the main BOQ items. They come from the gaps between scopes. Interfaces like civil versus MEP, base build versus fit out, employers direct contractors versus main contractor, utility provider versus project contractor. If you don't define who owns, for example, sleeves and openings, routing coordination, final tie-ins, testing and commissioning boundaries, then you are inviting multi-party blame game later. A resilient contract includes an interface responsibility matrix in an annex. Rows interface items. In the rows you put interface items. For example, low voltage cables from MDBs to final panel, fire alarm integration with landlord systems, etc. Columns. Party A, Party B, joint responsibility, who's ever responsible. Clear ticks showing who does what. References this matrix inside the PCs as a contractually binding document. It also requires interface meetings as part of the program obligations. As an illustrative example here, on a major infrastructure package, undefined cable routing zones caused 9 months delay. With no interface matrix, the decision makers split cost 50-50 because the contract did not assign that clash clearly. Resilient contracts redraw the lines before the dispute, not during it. Okay, resilient contracts are program aware. Too many contracts talk about time for completion, variations, claims, but never mention how these interact with the actual baseline schedule. A resilient contract cross-reference, Clause 8, time, Clause 18, variations, Clause 20, claims, with approved baseline program. It defines how variation instructions will be analyzed for time impact. It defines also float ownership, which is often not expressly settled unless the contract says so. So define it. The method of schedule impact analysis, as example, time impact analysis using fragments. It requires the following: periodic program updates, formal mechanism for incorporating variations, impacts, the link between notices, program updates, and EOT claims. Without this, every delay event becomes a debate about was it critical, did it consume float, who owned the float, etc. A resilient contract defines, reduces those arguments by defining critical path impact logic up front. Okay? A fragile contract is one where the employer tries to dump everything on the contractor. The contractor artificially lower price and hopes to fight later. This is a litigation factory. A resilient contract uses a shared risk register during tender and negotiation. It classifies employer-controlled risk, contractor-controlled risks, and shared or uncontrolled risks. It aligns risk ownership with control and mitigation capability. It deals honestly with inflation and volatile commodities like steel, copper, fuel, via escalation formulas or reopener clauses. It also deals with political and macro risks via insurance or government guarantees if possible. It does not pretend that infinite risk can be priced in finite margins, okay? Contractors can absorb systematic shocks alone. This is not, practical. Risk sharing, when done intelligently, often reduces total cost and dispute risk by cutting contingency padding and post-award fights. So Let's look at the top 12 resilient contract practices. Okay, first, you could use this as a checklist. First, identify project-specific risks clearly. Technical, political, financial, environmental. Map interfaces with an interface responsibility matrix. Make it an enforceable annex. Customize exceptional events, clause 18, particular conditions. Define which events give time only and which, if any, give cost. Define DAAB activation and timelines. Standing DAAB for complex projects with clear rules. Specify claim notice formats and minimum content. Clause 20 particular conditions plus sample templates. Detail termination procedures and flow. Clause 15 and 16 particular conditions plus flow chart if possible. Include visual process maps for notices, EOT, variation handling, termination, dispute escalation. Cross-link schedule and claims. Program clauses that tie variations and claims to critical path logic. Clarify delay categories, excusable versus compensable versus non-excusable. Address price escalation proactively. Indexed formulas, reopeners, or capped adjustments, for example. Add an obligation/entitlement matrix, one-page summary of key employer and contractor responsibilities. 12. Scenario test the contract. Run hypotheticals. What happens if late access, design changes, force majeure, termination, and see if the contract still makes sense. A resilient contract is not perfect. It is tested intellectually and operationally before it ever reaches the site. So to end this episode and season 2 as well, if you have followed season 2 this far, you are no longer just aware of FIDIC risk. You are moving toward being strategic with it. Because contracts are not tested in Word files, they are tested under delay, under financial pressure, under political change, in DAAB hearings and tribunal rooms. Okay? So, again, a good contract is a legal tool. A great contract is a survival map. Okay? So, by this, we come, again, to the conclusion of season 2. I would like to thank you as usual. I hope I will see you in season 3, where we're gonna look at FIDIC and the real world, gray zones, controversies, and complexities. I hope to see you then. Thank you.